this morning is, I don't know the exact title, but essentially how we decide to treat expensive and rare diseases.
Yes, that sounds like a great introduction. Thank you so much, Dr. Altman, for inviting me. And again, I wish that this was not being as challenging as it's proving here. One option is I could send the slides to another person who could share it, is the only other thing I can think to try.
Clint, you might be the most savvy. Can you do that?
Yes, ma'am. Send it to me.
Okay. And may I please have your email?
I'm sending it to you in the chat.
Oh, great. Okay, sending it your way.
Clint, how are you going to send it out to everybody?
So I can actually, I should be able to share the screen and I should be able to do it.
Oh, so you'll share.
So it'll look like this. So this will be my screen and I can,
okay,
if I get
good,
her email,
good.
I can share it to you.
Okay, I just sent it. Let me know if you get it.
So Emily, go ahead, and Clint
Sure.
will share the screen and we
Great.
should be good.
So as you heard, I'm here to talk about some of the ethical considerations for rare and expensive diseases. And I am both a pediatric ICU physician and a pediatric bioethicist, and have interest in this exact area because I think it's really challenging to think through all the complexities that exist within the sphere that we practice every day. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you a little bit more about this. So the plan for the day is that I don't have any disclosures, but I do have two disclaimers. One is that I am not an economist, even though I will talk a little bit about economics in this talk. And I'm going to leave you with some unsatisfying answers at the end, because unfortunately that is the nature of ethics. We work a lot in the gray, and a lot of reasonable people disagree, and many of the outcomes are suboptimal. So just wanted to get that out from the beginning. And then we're going to go through a case just to demonstrate a little bit more specifically what we're going to be talking about. We'll then review some of the ethical considerations that we need to be thinking through with these types of patient scenarios. And then I think it's important that we pause and actually take a look at the historical and the economic context that we are practicing in, because there are some legal limitations and other components that we need to think about. Then after that, we will try and answer some of the questions that are brought up by the case. And then we will hopefully have a case conclusion. And then I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions. And given that I have taken up a lot of time, I'm going to try and speed through some of these sections that maybe may not be as interesting or need as much detail. So we're going to start off with a case of, and this is completely fictional and made up. I just did this for the sake of discussion. And the picture that I pulled is a stock photo from the internet of a child on BiPAP. So I don't know anything about this child's story. But our theoretical patient is a 6-month-old who has spinal muscular atrophy type 1, which affects 450 to 500 babies born every year. And without intervention results in death by age 2 in the vast majority of those patients. Thank you so much. I will. Perfect, here we are. So in the past couple of years, 2 new drugs have come to market to treat this rare condition. The first is, the trade name is Spinraza, but it's otherwise known as nusinersen. I'll say Spinraza because it's actually easier. And this is a medication that was approved by the FDA in 2016. It is given intrathecally. And so obviously, in addition to the cost of the drug, you have to consider the cost of a child coming in for an intrathecal medication administration with anesthesia and all the other costs. And in the first year, you have 4 initial doses, and the total is $750,000. Then for subsequent years and for the duration of your life, hypothetically, you require maintenance dosing 3 times a year, and that is $375,000. And again, these are costs that we're thinking of for the duration of your life. And then as of last year, or I guess 2019, this new gene therapy came to market called Zolgensma, and it is a viral vector that actually introduces the healthy DNA to make the missing protein for your motor neurons to function appropriately. So it's a really cool technology. It's a one-time dose, and it is the most expensive medication that has ever been brought to market at over $2.1 million. And so, as you can imagine, there are lots of ethical discussions and considerations that need to be had when considering such an expensive medication for one single patient. Next slide, please. So here's just a few of the ethical questions that are raised. There are many, many more, but some of them are, does the drug cost have to be this high? Who pays and who should pay? Is there any societal value for these drugs? And how do we fairly allocate resources? Resources being either the drug itself or the money required to pay for the drug. And then how do we consider social justice concerns? So these are just a few of the many questions that these cases bring up. Next slide, please. So I think we really need to talk about our ethical duties. And when we talk about that, we really have to consider who matters. So are we thinking about our ethical duties to an individual, or are we thinking about our ethical duties to a group or society at large? And those two things, I will go on to share, are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but most of the time are. Next slide, please. So I think some of you may be familiar with kind of the concept of principalism, which is frequently used in medicine as kind of our ethical guidelines. And there's an asterisk here in the presentation because this is specifically for a Western medicine point of view. This is not true of Eastern medicine or other types. So I am going to be speaking to this limited view of medicine for the rest of the presentation. And again, many of you are familiar with these 4 basic tenets of ethics: beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. With beneficence being doing what is best for the patient. And interestingly, there may be very different interpretations of what is best, especially in the world of pediatrics, where what a parent thinks may be very different from what the care team thinks. Non-maleficence is the active avoidance of harm and the recognition of both anticipated and unanticipated harms. And this is what we took an oath not to do. Autonomy, you are all familiar with, is really the respect for self-determination of patients, and it's the right to accept or reject medical recommendations if a person has medical decision-making capacity. In pediatrics, children don't, and so their parents and or caregivers are their surrogate decision makers. When you have a little child who really doesn't have a way to communicate what they'd want, then their parents make the decisions for them. As children get older and become teenagers, then you can kind of use what you think the child would have wanted as a substituted judgment, but that is a different ethics talk for a different day. So lastly, and kind of where we're going to focus here is in the justice area. So justice is this concept that emphasizes fairness and equality among individuals, and it ensures that costs and benefits are fairly distributed when we're thinking about it from a practical standpoint. And this is really a specific notion of distributive justice. And this is really where I'm going to focus most of our discussion today. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through each of these individually, but considerations of individual justice are the most important when you're thinking about the patient right in front of you. So that is a right to basic health care. It's a duty not to abandon, or the rule of rescue, as we will discuss. There is rights to try medications. And then there's this concept of egalitarianism and social justice that we'll get into. Next slide, please. So the right to basic health care, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the talk, but we're talking about this moral human right. It's not considered legal everywhere, and we'll talk about that more later. But most people would agree that most people are owed a minimum level of health required to live a full life. But again, what is considered minimum or basic is up for debate. And so, nothing can be clear cut in ethics. And then one of the most important concepts that I wanted to bring forward is this idea that the ability to pay is morally irrelevant. It has no moral bearing on what's right and what's wrong. And that's, I think, a huge component of these very expensive medications that we need to talk about. Next slide, please. So then there is this concept of non-abandonment, or the rule of rescue. So non-abandonment is really that doctors shouldn't abandon their patients. It goes against our oath. And that society should not abandon those in great need. And specifically for rare diseases, society recognizes the importance of improving health for patients with these diseases that are severe and lack alternative treatments. And that is the case for many of these rare and severe diseases. The rule of rescue is just the perception that society and individuals both have a duty to save an endangered life if it's possible. And so we all kind of have this knee-jerk reaction to want to do that when we can. Next slide, please. So the right to try is an interesting one, and this is one that we think of with experimental drugs. So early on in the course of drug development, you have clinical equipoise, or you should. You really don't know whether this experimental therapy is going to be better, worse, or the same than the current standard therapy. And so when you don't know any of that information, no one really can argue that you have a right to try that experimental drug. But as the process goes on and a drug potentially demonstrates benefit, you have a growing right to try, especially if there are no available alternatives. If you could hit return. Thanks, and one more time. So this over here is really where this compassionate use is that we do a lot in pediatrics, and I'm sure that it's done in adult medicine as well. Where you appeal for compassionate use to the FDA to say, we really don't have any other options. It seems like this drug may be beneficial, even though it's not FDA approved. Can we please get access to it? Next slide, please. And then the notion of egalitarianism, or social justice, is really, that every person is owed an equal opportunity for outcome. I really like this cartoon in the bottom of the screen here. On the left, you see the demonstration of the difference between equality and equity. So on the left, you see equality. Everybody gets the same size box to stand on. But as you can tell, the outcomes are different, and not everyone can reach the apple in the same way. As opposed to equity, where people are not getting the same height of box, but they're all able to reach the apple. And so it's really this notion that we want everybody to be able to reach the apple, even if that means that people don't get the exact same size box. And so this requires that we recognize individual circumstance and that we acknowledge the inequities that exist within our system, whether that's socioeconomic, racial, whatever the case may be. And so there are many different ethicists and philosophers that have talked about egalitarianism and justice. And John Rawls is one of the most famous of these. And he talks about this notion of the difference principle. And that is that we should really be focusing on prioritizing the least well off when we are trying to get everybody up to this higher common level. Next slide, please. So let's get back to our case and apply these concepts. So beneficence, why would we want to give her the gene therapy after she's already gotten the Spinraza therapy? Well, hopefully it will prolong her life and at high quality. And so that's very beneficial and in her best interest. Non-maleficence, she will die before the age of 2 if she has failed Spinraza and she has SMA type 1. So we are avoiding and or delaying morbidity and mortality related to this disease by providing her with the medication. Considerations for autonomy, well, again, it's not her, but it's her parents, and they want everything done to save their baby's life, which is the most common thing that we see in pediatrics, not surprisingly. And then when you look at these justice concerns, we have a duty not to abandon her. We have a duty to rescue her if rescue is available. She has a right to health, regardless of whether she has a rare disorder or a common disorder, and her life is just as valuable with or without this disease. So when thinking about it from this standpoint, she definitely is a kid who would qualify for receiving this expensive gene therapy. Okay, next slide. But we have to think about the bigger picture. And I think that this concept has become very familiar for most, given our current pandemic. But the concept of utilitarianism, which is really that the individual is not what is important. We need to focus on the aggregate good. And so we need to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And in healthcare, that's typically saving or protecting the greatest number of lives possible. but we don't really consider the individual person when we make these decisions. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, are these goals mutually exclusive? And they're not unless resources are limited. But as we all know, resources are limited. So these two goals are oftentimes at odds. And then you can click through a couple times, please. Thanks. So, you can see that healthcare resources, especially healthcare dollars, are incredibly limited in the United States. And this is just a graph here that shows that the US spends far more on healthcare than any other country. And it's a significant proportion of our gross domestic product. And this is from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that provided this slide. Okay, next, please. So that gets us to this notion of distributive justice, which is that we don't have enough of a resource to go around. And so how do we fairly allocate how we distribute that resource across the people who are in need? And so there's a number of different ways that you can do this, and there's no right way. So do you consider the greatest need? Do you consider who's most likely to benefit from it? Do you consider who is likely to benefit the longest, which oftentimes will then serve to get kids priority? Does your role in society matter? Does it matter that you are the president of a country or that you are a leading scientist who's helping to create a vaccine for a global pandemic? Are those the kinds of things that we should be thinking about or considering in how we allocate these scarce resources? Is that all unfair and we just need to do it based off of first come, first serve? Well, there can be problems with that too, because poor people may live further out. Other people may not have transportation to get in. And so maybe the fairest way to do it is a lottery, just at random. So these are all different ways that we can consider how to fairly allocate a scarce resource. Many people use the analogy of a pie, and that your pie is your limited resource. And so could you just cut smaller pieces of pie to give to people? And that would be the definition of equality that we talked about. And that is something that doesn't work for something that is fixed and finite, like a ventilator during COVID-19, but may be more applicable for financial resources. But as we talked about, that's truly equality and maybe not equity. And so equity would require that we have different slices of pie based off of people's needs. And then the important thing that we need to really talk about are the economic considerations, because as was discussed in the introduction, there's so much money that is put into a single patient, and what could be done with that same amount of money and how many patients could that benefit? So that's where the health economists come in when they look at cost effectiveness or quality adjusted life years gained based off of the cost. And really, it's uncomfortable, but they're helping to determine a dollar value on life. So these are some of the things that we all have to think about when taking care of these patients who are in need of very expensive medications. Okay, so this is just a quick break because that was a lot of information. But for the sake of time, I'll skip the Gary Larson cartoon. We can move to the next. Thanks. This is just a very brief overview, that there's a lot of history and context that we need to discuss. So you can go to the next slide. So let's start with defining a rare disease and an expensive disease. So an orphan disease is a disease that affects less than 200,000 people in the US. There are currently over 6,000 diseases that qualify based off of this definition, and it affects 25 to 30 million Americans. So even though the diseases in and of themselves are rare, rare diseases impact a pretty significant number of people. And an orphan drug is a drug that is intended for treatment, prevention, or diagnosis of an orphan disease or meets cost recovery provisions of the Act that I'll get into shortly. Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about orphan drugs and their history. So prior to 1983, there were only 10 drugs brought to market that would have qualified as orphan drugs. These drugs are very expensive to research and develop, and because they are for such a small population, oftentimes the pharmaceutical companies cannot recoup the money invested. And so there's really no incentive for the pharmaceutical industry to invest in making medications for these rare diseases. So in 1983, the Orphan Drug Act targeted just that. because of the lack of prevention and treatment options for rare diseases and conditions due to the difficulty recovering research and development costs. It was enacted to encourage the development of treatments, and it initially applied to products whose sales in the US would not recover incurred costs during product development. And it was somewhat vague in terms of its definition when it was first introduced in 1983. So in 1984, there was an amendment that really helped to define what they meant by a rare disease. And interestingly, although there are parallels in Europe, the definitions are actually very different because it's based on incidence versus prevalence, and there are significant implications for that. I won't get into it, but it's just a really interesting thing to read about if you have some spare time. And then in 2002, the Rare Disease Act came into place, and essentially they recognizes that they recognized they didn't have a good funding strategy for this, and that they didn't really have good oversight for who was in charge of research and development for these things. So there's now an office that formally exists to help with the creation and research areas. Next slide, please. So what are the incentives of the Orphan Drug Act? Well, it's these four things right here. So there's grant funding for academic researchers or companies. There's tax credits for expense incurred during clinical trial phases, which can last for years. There are waivers for filing fees for the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. And then there is a 7-year market exclusivity. And I think that this is the one that, from my reading, seems to be the biggest seller for the pharmaceutical companies. Next slide, please. Yeah. So here is a graph that just shows the number of orphan drugs that have been designated since the Orphan Drug Act came into being in 1983, and then the number of approvals. So the number of approvals are significantly lower than the number of designations. And so some people have argued that the financial incentives are insufficient given the lack of stimulated approved orphan drugs. And the number of designations is actually pretty increased over time, but is not what I think the designers really envisioned. If you could hit the return a couple times. Thanks. So it's this difference here between the approvals and the designations where compassionate use and right to try really comes into play. So these medications that have not yet been approved but have been designated orphan drugs and may have a tiny bit of benefit but not enough for the FDA to be super excited, that's where a lot of the patients will claim that they want to try it, and where they may ask, or you may consider asking the FDA for approval under compassionate use. So let's talk about what the results have actually been. So in 2010, orphan drugs accounted for 22% of all pharmaceutical sales, so not an insignificant portion. And the return on investment for orphan drugs was actually greater than the return on investment for non-orphan drugs, especially when they were brought to market because of that 7 years of exclusivity. And then in addition, the global sales of these orphan drugs also can result in significant revenue. So the question of whether or not the incentives were enough to stimulate orphan drugs, it's definitely enough to stimulate economic motivation for the pharmaceutical industries, even though it might not have produced the actual number of medications and drugs that had been hoped for. Okay, next slide, please. So then we just need to talk a little bit about the historical context for rare diseases, and that falls kind of under disability. So in 1946, the World Health Organization was the first to proclaim that every human had the right to the highest attainable standard of health. In 1948, the UN had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was inclusive, but didn't specifically define disabilities as one of the groups that was protected, and also didn't specifically talk about the rights of children. So in 1989, there was the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which specifically called out that children have a right to health and a right to protection. And the US took its sweet time to sign that in 1995 and has yet to ratify it. It's the only country that has signed and not ratified. In 1990, the US did pass the Americans with Disabilities Act and defined a person with disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a person who has a history or record of such impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. And there are protections that go along with that. And then finally, in 2006, the UN had a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. And in 2009, the US signed, but again, failed to ratify that. But essentially, it says that all humans have the highest attainable standard of health without discrimination, and they specifically called out, especially on the basis of disability. So we have legal reasons for needing to protect people as well, although not in the US. So the historical context for rare diseases is that there are both ethical and legal protections for patients, and that we need to consider that when thinking about rare disease treatments. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so going back to our case, I think it's important that we point out that when we talk about giving this little girl on the left $2.1 million for this one-time drug, we are not saying that that is directly taking $2.1 million away from all of these other cute children here on the right. It's not the money, if it doesn't go here, goes here type of situation. It's far more complicated than that. And it makes some of the ethical considerations more challenging that we'll get into in the next slide. So we're going to go back and we're going to try and answer some of these questions, recognizing that, again, as I pointed out in the beginning, it might not be satisfying. The next slide, please. So does the drug cost have to be so high? Probably not, but it's actually really hard to tell because this is a complete market failure. So the economists can't really give us straight answers. In addition to it being a market failure, it's also a function of global regulatory differences. And so we're not going to be able to get a clear-cut answer for all expensive drugs. Part of it is because in addition to like the demand being inelastic for these conditions that are often life-threatening without alternative therapies, the average direct healthcare cost to patient ratio with rare diseases is hard to know because there's significant variability in the patient, in the disease characteristics. And so it's really not as straightforward of a question as we'd like. However, we can bring it back to the two drugs that we talked about at the beginning with this case. So nusinersen or Spinraza is that one that was $750,000 for the first year and $375,000 for each subsequent year. So if you actually do the math out, in 10 years, it's over $4 million, and that is just for the drug. So the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review is an independent research group that studies drug pricing. And they use cost effectiveness considerations of something being cost effective if it is equal to or less than $100,000 to $150,000 per quality adjusted life year gained. And so using that, they found that Spinraza or nusinersen was an unreasonably priced drug. It would need an over 80% reduction in cost in order to actually be cost effective. And so that would bring that first year costs down from the 400,000 range to the 70 to 130,000 range. However, with gene therapy and Zolgensma, they actually found that from a cost effectiveness standpoint, that the price actually might be more reasonable. They estimated that the cost could be anywhere between 1.2 and 2.1 million. So it's obviously on the higher side, but that although it's expensive, it's not all that expensive relative to the benefit. If this little girl gets this medication at 6 months and goes on to lead a relatively normal, healthy life for the rest of her life, that investment in funds getting spread out over that period of time is much more reasonable to consider. Next slide, please. So who pays and who should pay? Well, in our current setup, there are many different payers. There's a huge economic burden on our patients, and it's a huge barrier to access. It's also a huge burden on third-party payers and potentially to society at large. Yet there is a societal mandate to provide some degree of coverage, as we've talked about, both in terms of the UN declarations for human rights, the Americans with Disabilities Act, et cetera. So bringing this back to our specific example, nusinersen, if you have private insurance, you get access to financial assistance. You can also get help with drug and or visit copays. and they make it work. However, if you have government insurance, then you don't get access and you have to rely solely on charity. So that creates a huge ethical dilemma. And similarly for the gene therapy, private insurance covers 90% of patients, which is not horrible. But if you have government insurance, it only covers 30% of patients. And so these disparities between the insurance type are really ethically problematic and make it so that if you are poor and you have this disease, you are potentially not going to gain access unless you have someone who's willing to provide charity for you. And if you are lucky enough to have good insurance and you have one of these rare diseases, then you'll have access without as much issue. So these are just some of the ethical challenges with payment. Next slide, please.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
How are these handled in countries like the UK or Sweden or Canada, where there's socialized medicine and a completely, I'll say, better system of financing these things?
Yeah, that is a really great question. And I don't really know enough to give you a good answer. I know that the European countries have signed and ratified these laws, and they have lots of protections. But if you guys remember, there was a very famous case, the Charlie Gard case in the UK. And the family wanted all these things done, and the UK said it's not going to result in the outcome that you want, and so it's not worth the investment of money. And so they went with the economic consideration. So I would imagine that there are limitations in those countries, but I don't know exactly how they would handle this particular situation. But I imagine they have maybe a more streamlined plan than we do here in the US. Okay. So next question, is there societal value for orphan drugs? Well, potentially. So some of the orphan drug development has created new technologies that are helpful to create other drugs. Sometimes we find that there's an alternative use for a drug that was developed. And then where I think it's really interesting, you could potentially have reinvestment of the profits, if present for a pharmaceutical company, towards making and distributing more basic drugs at a lower cost to those in need. So if that profit from $2.1 million then goes into creating antibiotics at much lower cost that can then go out to children in need, then maybe there's a different ethical calculus that we need to be thinking of. And then there's also the societal value of investing in this little girl, for this example. Like, is she going to become the president? Is she going to do something really great for the world? And we've invested in her. So these are all the potential questions for the societal value of orphan drugs. Next slide, please. So then the really tough question of, okay, so how do we fairly allocate these resources, either the drugs themselves or the finances? What we have tried to do, as demonstrated by this current pandemic, is that we try to avoid the need for rationing altogether so that we don't have to say, you get this and you don't get this. And one of the ways that we could do that is to try and further incentivize, so long as the profits get fed back into making other drugs more affordable, like I mentioned, which is obviously super easy. Another very easy option would be to have a more ideal global approach. But unfortunately, there aren't really globally accepted ethical principles. As you just mentioned, there are very different forms of healthcare systems in different countries. We currently don't have the international cooperation that we'd like to. A lot of these rare diseases have rare disease registries, and so countries are trying to put their information together in order to learn more and benefit patients with them. But we are still lacking in that arena. So I think that would be our 30,000 foot pie in the sky goal that we are far from right now. Next slide, please. And then how do we consider social justice concerns? So I think this was kind of to the point of your question. How do we make sure that there's not inequitable access based off of your socioeconomic status or your ability to pay? How do we make sure that diseases or conditions that are more prevalent in minority groups don't get overlooked, because then you're potentially further marginalizing an already marginalized population, and that can result in aggregate harm. So we just need to make sure that, just because this one disease only impacts this one minority population, that we don't discount it as being valuable and important. So when I was preparing for this talk and thinking through this, I did a literature search and came across a very recently published systematic review. It came out in October of 2020. And they were looking at the ethical questions linked to rare diseases and orphan drugs. And I really liked this table. I think it is similar to kind of how we just talked through it. But on the left of the column, in the approach to achieving justice and cost effectiveness, it says no, we will not invest in orphan drugs because we have to think about our economic values and we have to consider the benefits of the group over the individual. And they said that the ethical principles and approaches to support that are utilitarian, opportunity cost, and distributive justice. On the right, you can argue that yes, we should be making investments in orphan drugs, that non-economic values should be prioritized, and that individuals matter over the group. And that is informed by the approaches and principles of the rights-based approach that we talked about, beneficence, non-abandonment, rule of rescue, and the potential value to society of scientific advancement. But I circled here distributive justice because I do think that if the money that gets or revenue generated, profit generated from drug creation gets fed back into helping out other people, then the distributive justice could actually be used to argue for both sides. And I was hoping that they were going to be able to provide me and you with some of the answers to these really tough questions. But in fact, it just continued to generate more and more and more questions. So they tried to distill down the questions into 5 categories. But I really bring this slide to you just to show you that it's very complicated and that there are far more questions than answers with respect to how we allocate financial resources, with respect to how we consider compassionate use and accelerated drug approval, whether there should be limits to whether there's disease prevalence versus incidence for qualifying as a rare disease, how we encourage cooperation, and whether we should have ethics committees established for rare diseases. So all really good questions that have yet to be answered in a satisfactory way. Next slide, please. So let's go back to our case. We'll say that this little girl is very lucky. She's in the private insurance category, so she gets insurance approval. She gets her gene therapy. It's effective. She is now living and 7 and wants to be the first female president of the United States. And so we've invested in her future by giving her this very, very expensive medication. Okay, next slide, please. So with that, I wanted to open it up to some questions.
Well, let's ask a real world question. So what happens over at Children's if this child is a patient or a rare immunodeficiency, which would be more relevant to our specialty, a kid with a rare form of SCID or something, and somebody has to decide to spend $2 million on gene therapy or bone marrow transplant, and who foots the bill? And who decides who lives and dies, and who's making those decisions in the real world?
It's a great question. The way that Children's has worked in the past is that they have been incredibly lucky that a lot of people have donated funds for us to have uncompensated care funds. And so for patients who are in need, we will oftentimes fill in the payment gap. So the family pays whatever they can pay, the insurance company pays whatever they will pay, and whatever remains, we will try and provide charity care for. That up until this past year has been something that we've been very lucky, where we've had to avoid this question of allocating, even though it's been challenging. But now that we are in different financial circumstances, I think it's a question that we're going to have to be addressing differently. I think that for SCID, for SMA, for these diseases where the medication is a one-time thing and expensive and potentially life-saving with a young child who's going to go on and live for years and years and years and years, we have just avoided having to make that decision by trying to find the funds from another source, because no one really wants to have to say, no to that family. And in fact, we've actually gone the opposite route in ethics. And I've had a family who declined undergoing a bone marrow transplant for SCID. And the team was worried that the mother and father were not acting in the best interest of the child, and actually got an ethics consult because they wanted to compel this family to proceed with bone marrow transplant for their child's immune deficiency. So I think that we are definitely still in a we can and therefore we should mentality. And as resources become more strained, I think people are going to have to start thinking differently about these situations.
So does anybody say that that $1 million might provide basic health care to inner city indigent kids who don't even get basic health care in our society? And is there ever a committee decision to say that's better for the societal good as to how to spend limited resources?
So it's a great question. One of my career goals is to do more organizational ethics, where we think about these patients with rare diseases as a bigger group of patients requiring very high level expensive medications and how that money gets distributed. But I think that, as I kind of alluded to, we can't definitively say that by putting the money towards this one child, we are therefore not putting that same amount of money towards other children in need. So I think that the bottom line is we should be investing in local children who don't have their basic needs met. I think that basic needs are a human right. I think that we should make sure that we are able to provide those services. And so, Children's is trying to do more outreach clinics, is trying to do more uncompensated care. And again, those uncompensated care funds that exist, are replenished by people. And so there are some thoughts that if a donor says, I will give you $5 million, but I want that $5 million to go to children with cancer, the money comes with a stipulation. And so there are a lot of folks who are fortunately now trying to invest in more primary care, into more basic care, but we definitely have a lot of inequities within our system that we need to be addressing differently. So I would agree with you that I think we need to think differently about this, but as it currently stands at Children's, at least, there is not a policy that goes across the board for that in terms of how we approach it.
Well, I think we need to look at how other first world countries that have a more socialized and I would think equitable form of medicine handle these questions, because things are so fragmented, and frankly, our healthcare delivery system is so poor in this country that it's almost impossible to answer these questions the way we allocate. I mean, if you look at our society, and my way of thinking is it's clear to me that if you don't have access to healthcare and you don't have wealth and connections, you don't get these treatments, and there's an unfair skewing of this in our society.
Len, Mike Weiss here. As you know, I looked at U.S. healthcare system versus some of the other first world countries' healthcare systems a few years ago, and it's not perfect in other places. I don't think we should hold other countries up to utopia. At the same time I gave that talk, and while governments pay in many countries for the medications, at the same time, a friend of mine was visiting who's head of pediatric respiratory at Karolinska Hospital in Stockholm. Mm-hmm. And as head of pediatric respiratory, her department had access in a year to 12 patients for omalizumab. And that was it. They had 12, that's what the medicine money was allocated. They were trying to split patients and give them half doses to see if they can get more patients. So the medicine's free, the patients get it, but 12 people were allowed in Karolinska Hospital for pediatric respiratory disease. So it's not perfect. There's limited resources in every country.
I'm not saying we should mimic other countries. We should see if we can learn if somebody does it better.
Yeah, no, totally. I agree. I just don't want to make another country utopia.
Well, this is obviously a very controversial topic. especially in the year of COVID, when the country is spending trillions of dollars on a completely different issue, but there are finite resources even in our country. So I welcome other people chiming in here. You know, when this talk is over, everybody goes back to doing what they do every day. And just interesting how we deal with this. And that's why I wanted this presentation to stimulate some discussion amongst ourselves. There are 40 of you out there. Somebody must have something to say.
Hi, Emily. This is Paul McBride. I just have a question about your access to insurance. I mean, you and academia seem to have a better interaction with insurance carriers than we in reality do. And I don't have the resources in terms of time, staff, or money to fight the insurance companies to get the access that you claim that they provide for us. Do you have any suggestions on how those of us with limited time, staff, and money to even fight the insurance companies can get any of the things you talked about?
So full disclosure, I have no interaction with any of the insurance companies in the ICU. I, kind of say that this is what I want to do, and I have people who help me out. So I don't have any practical advice other than to say that some of the information that I pulled was directly from the websites of the pharmaceutical companies. So like Spinraza has a whole thing of like, please call these people for financial assistance or call this person. And so I don't know if for the particular issue at hand, there's a specific resource outside of the insurance company themselves that could be useful. But I was surprised that there were a number of different phone numbers and ways of communicating with different folks at, I think Biogen is one of the companies that makes the medications I talked about. And so I don't know if actually going to the drug company itself would be a helpful kind of middle person to get involved. But I totally realize that I live in this little academic bubble where this can be talked about in such a kind of hand-wavy theoretical sense.
Hi, Dr. Berkman. This is Kes. I'm one of the fellows here. Thanks for giving this talk. I had a question with regard to the area of medical ethics, and especially in the United States and in that field. Is there more consideration now with regard to considering the ethics of philanthropy? I guess it's one thing for us mere mortals to give a couple $100 or maybe $1,000 if we're fortunate enough to hospitals or other charities. But when there are other individuals who are capable of giving millions of dollars to gain tax exemption or tax to be excluded from paying taxes or anything like that, is that becoming a topic of discussion in the ethics field, and particularly here in the United States? I know we rely a lot on philanthropy to run a lot of our children's hospitals in particular. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
It's a really great question. I have not really been a part of discussions about that particular topic. I think it is really important. And I think that, how you donate your money from a tax standpoint is a very interesting question. But that has not been something that I have read a lot about myself or been having discussions about. But I do think that, again, how we kind of distribute philanthropic funds is really important. And there are ways of doing it that are going to potentially improve life for many people versus a few people. Because like I said, we do get donations sometimes that are targeted for a very specific area. And so then it's hard to make those funds go where we really like them to. And so I think that those are some of the ethical challenges that we've talked about a little bit. Pediatric cancer is heartbreaking, and you see kids without hair and you think, oh, I want to donate to that. So a lot of people have donated specifically to our cancer care funds, or a lot of people, hate the idea of a baby needing a major heart surgery. And so like there are a lot of philanthropic donors that donate to specifically the heart center. So there are certain pockets of the hospital that seem to get more philanthropic funds than others, and they are allocated specifically to that one area. And so then, arguably what you should do is the remainder of the general philanthropic funds should not go to those places that already have earmarked funding. But those are the kinds of conversations that we've been having so far about philanthropic funds, not the ones that you raised, but I think it's a really important question.
Emily, this discussion could go on indefinitely. Unfortunately, we have another conference that starts at 8 o'clock that our fellows and myself have to join. I'd like to invite you back for our next year so we can extend this discussion. I know I have many questions and many opinions about this. So we'll have to leave that for another time.
Yeah, I would love to come back and I can do more reading and research, kind of comparing how other countries deal with it compared to the US, maybe for the next round, so that I can actually answer some of your great questions.
I also wonder what happens in 2/3 of the people in the world who don't have, first world healthcare. I assume these diagnoses are not made and people die, to be direct about it.
Yes. I am. One of my areas of interest is also in international patient programs where we're bringing rich people from other countries to different hospitals in the US for healthcare. And there are many ethical concerns that I have about that, especially given that, the people who already have a lot are the ones that are getting access to care in the United States and we're leaving everyone else behind. So we could talk about that too. Plenty to talk about.
All right, well, maybe we'll have you kick off our sessions in September. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Do you want to go through the last two slides, just because I know you guys need the word of the day?
What's the word of the day? People ask me.
Oh, yeah.
Ethics. That makes good sense. So long.
Thank you all. Sorry again for the delay in starting, and I appreciate help with the slides. Thanks, everyone.
Well, Clint, thank you very much for your technical ability to help us pull this off.
Yes, thank you very much, Clint. Next time I'll have these things smoothed out more. All right.